Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, hey everybody, thank you for joining us today for this interview on the Kingdoms podcast. I'm really grateful to have joining me Laura Fess. Laura, thanks for being here.
No worries.
Laura's got an incredible story, has experience in some really significant vocational spaces, has been on church staffs in multiple countries, and now is actively serving as a therapist. And so we're going to be taking a dive into some key things surrounding church and culture and faith formation and emotionally healthy spirituality. But before we get there, I wonder, Laura, could you just share with us a little bit about your story? Because you have a really compelling story and I haven't even had the chance to hear it all, but your journey into ministry and ultimately what now has led you to pursue your current vocation as a therapist.
Well, I would say this. So I grew up just a normal person, as in no ministry expectations for my future, not a pastor's kid. My parents got saved when they were pregnant with me. So didn't even grow up with like an inherited, theology, right? We were all kind of learning together, right? So kind of cool. Unfortunately, because of that, we had some wild, charismatic church experiences, when I was very little, and then, kind of landed in a really lovely, healthy church for the rest of my adolescence and into adult years. But then I married a pastor's kid.
Oh yeah, and everything changed.
Oh, I got thrown into the deep end of like, oh, this is like a world. What is this world? I had my own kind of faith conversion in my late teen years. And I never grew up thinking I want to be a pastor. Like, wasn't even on my radar. And even though the theology of the community I was part of wasn't, anti-women, I just didn't even I never saw a girl. Why would I think to do it? And so, then I married my hubby, who's lovely, and he was a pastor's kid. He's a pastor, and we were working at Mapleview, which I know is in the town that how you and I met back in the day.
Yeah.
And the youth pastor had resigned. So at that time, I was a child and youth worker, so working with youth with mental health. And the youth pastor resigned. And the senior pastor called me in and said, would you just babysit the youth group? You're Mike's wife. We know you until we hire someone. And I was like, okay, that sounds fun. I like teenagers. Yeah. And, it turned into 6 months and it was the best experience of my life. But I was in school doing my social work degree and was taking on a new work kind of role with a child protective agency. And I sat down with the lead pastor and said, hey, I can't do this anymore, volunteering, babysitting. And he said, oh, no worries, we've hired someone. I'm like, oh, perfect. He's like, why don't you come in, we'll talk about it. I'm like, okay. So I came in and he said, you.
That's one way to set up a meeting. And you said?
And I said, me? What do you mean? And he's like, oh, you think it should be you? And it was actually I remember crying like this, just like, what? I never thought this, I was having the time of my life. It was everything from a social worker, child and youth worker perspective around community development, interpersonal connection with teenagers, protective. My dream was to run basketball programs, drop in skate parks, really wrap around approaches with the family unit. And I thought, geez, the local church is amazing as a resource to the community, but I never thought I'd be hired as a pastor. So that moment was this wow, really? And honestly, was the best few years of my life. I was in that role for about 5 years and just had so much fun.
Yeah.
Was there stuff? Yeah.
Hmm.
Right. So we did that, and then it evolved to, we got hired at a church in Atlanta,
Hmm.
and that was awful.
Wow.
It was, it would hit all your criteria of a global mega church. It was one of the most abusive, toxic environments that my husband and I had ever been in.
Wow.
And so we lasted about 18 months there.
Wow.
Here you're like, tell me your story. You're like, geez, do I even want the story? We last about 18 months there. And a really important thing to know is that while I was youth pastoring, I was finishing my bachelor's because I'd already started it, and I got
Hmm.
a full scholarship for my master's. I had no
Awesome.
interest in doing my master's. So I was like, I have a dream job. Why would I do this?
Hmm.
So behind the scenes, I completed my master's.
Hmm.
And when we were moving to the States, we thought, oh, this is why God did that, so that we could get into the States, because that master's kind of gets you to the front of the line for a visa.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. So I thought, oh, this is God moving.
Yeah.
Well, little did we know that when we come back, that education would open a door for me to walk into something,
Hmm.
especially in a season when we were very burnt in a ministry
Yeah.
context and just needing a sabbatical
Hmm.
from vocational ministry.
Yeah.
And so I started working for a practice for about 3 years. And
Hmm.
then once I came out of a burnout, honestly, which is a whole other thing, I started feeling creative again
Hmm.
and feeling energy again. And
Hmm.
so I said to my hubby, I think it's time that I open up a practice.
Wow.
And so I left the group practice and opened up Box. And that's my long story.
With some really
Twists and
compelling
turns.
like elements to that. And I really respect you for thank you for your gracious honesty, because you're being
Yeah.
real and you're at the same time not throwing anybody under the bus. And it's not
Yeah.
always easy to do that. But
I hope.
that's, to be honest, Laura, it's experiences like that, the wonder and joy and delight
Mhm.
of 5 years in youth ministry,
Mhm.
followed by 18 months of just agony,
Yeah.
that is in a way heart-wrenching to hear about, but I realize
Yeah.
so formative and so shaping in your life. And I wonder, as someone who's had that experience, you've served on these very diverse church staffs, one in Canada, one
Yeah.
in the Southern United States.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit, obviously not asking for naming names, but unpack that place
Yeah.
of what does it look like for a church to be characterized by real health, like
Yeah.
holistic health, versus what does an unhealthy church look like?
So let me preface this by saying, so I am a social worker, okay,
Mm.
who has pastored. And I think that's a difference than someone who's a pastor who has social worked, okay?
Mm.
So I'm going to answer this question from the lens of a social worker
Okay.
who has pastored, okay?
Got you. Yeah.
So let's assume that the church has nailed their theology, okay?
Mm.
So we're not going to talk when it comes to healthy church style,
Mm.
theology, which might be a little bit of a left turn for the podcast for a second. But from a social work perspective, social work is the study of systems.
Mm.
Okay. Systems and structures, how society gets structured, how power is used in those systems and in those structures, how
Mm.
oppression becomes apparent because of power and system and structures. From a therapy perspective, if you work with a social worker, they don't see you as someone carrying an illness who needs to be fixed as the token issue, right? They see you as a system, right? Your
Mm.
body, your history, your experiences, your hormones, your, generational inherited traumas,
Mm-hmm.
working in a system, a family, working in a community, under a municipality, under a culture, right? So we're
Yeah.
systematic in how we view things, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So from a systems perspective, and structures, what is a healthy church and what is a not a healthy church? So a few things. A healthy church has a system for accountability.
Mm.
Okay. Now, how that plays out in different practically is very different, right? Most organizations would have a board and they would say, well, we have policies that keep people accountable, right?
Hmm.
But the actual practicality of what that looks like may not actually be accountability, right?
Okay.
So let me think of an example. Actually, I put some things down here. Yeah. So on like a board, who has voting power,
Hmm.
right? How are votes designated?
Hmm.
Can a lead pastor just usurp voting power because they veto it,
Hmm.
right? Is there committees that are brought in to handle special projects or by special projects too? I can also mean crisis, right?
Hmm.
Or hiring,
Hmm.
right? Or discipline for staff if there is some concerns around how they're using their power,
Hmm.
right? So unfortunately, in the unhealthy context that we were part of, just to speak from a practical experience perspective, accountability was a mantra, but it didn't actually happen practically,
Hmm.
right? The senior leader had absolute veto power. The
Wow.
board was one that was elected by the leader.
Wow.
Okay. This is not a small organization, right? They are handpicked by the leader. There is no timeline that they have to serve on before they step down,
Hmm.
right? They can be the treasurer for 20 years,
Wow.
So, a lot of people maybe are thinking like, well, does this apply to me? When I'm a frontline person in an organization, is this something only staff would become aware of? But I think it's really important when you enter under a system and under a structure to know,
Hmm.
how does accountability happen here,
Yeah.
right? Because accountability is what we use to undermine the natural inclination of the human desire for power.
Yeah.
I joke about it. I call it the Lucifer effect, where what happened when one beautiful, talented angel wanted power?
Right.
Scary, and there's a little bit of that in all of us. It's sin.
Hmm. It's evident the ways in which it can really corrupt not only leaders in different spheres, but church cultures and systems. And
Yeah.
it's compelling sometimes to see organizations from the inside out and to realize, wow, this is really healthy, or wow, this is really not good. And part of asking that question, Laura, and maybe this ties into sharing a bit on what the healthy side of things, maybe if there's 2 or 3 things you could point to say, these are really healthy characteristics in a healthy church.
Yeah.
Again, not like assuming that theology is solid and not
Yes.
having
What an
debates about,
assumption.
but we're hoping for the best. Yeah. Not having maybe debates about, style, like what clothes to wear, what genre of music is played. Could you speak to that piece of saying, okay, but for the average person who's sitting in a pew or sitting in a chair, who's just thinking about maybe more surfacey things like style, or like this church lines up with my denominational heritage, what would you be saying? Pay attention to this. Like, this is a really healthy indicator in the structure of the leadership team, or this is a really healthy element in the structure of the culture of that church family. What would you point people towards so they can be discerning in their own church involvement or own church decisions?
Yeah. I would say transparency is a really good indicator of health in a church.
Hmm.
Okay. And transparency being, now, okay, on your first Sunday sitting in a pew, can you tell this?
Hmm.
I would say probably not, but like on your very first Sunday, but there may be some red flags to look for, right?
Hmm.
Transparency being like, is there things that we do to minimize the opportunity for secrets to thrive in our power structure?
Wow.
And one of the best first signs would be, is the volunteers in the children's ministry vetted,
Hmm.
trained,
Hmm.
clearly designated? And can I, as a new parent, walk into the toddler's room without being stopped? Right?
Hmm.
Now, that's what a funny red flag to look for,
Hmm.
right? But what it says from a social work perspective is that if an organization takes very seriously the power dynamics that are inherent to our sinful nature,
Hmm.
and understands that in a community, vulnerability is present because we have children, we have elders, we have all kinds of vulnerabilities that exist, from mental wellness to different socioeconomic statuses to different diversity groups, right? Vulnerability is part of community. And if we are not on it, things can happen, right? So if I can walk into a church and just walk myself into the kids program, I am freaked out, right? Now, as a mom, you may be like, no, isn't that great? I just want to be able to walk in and change my baby and not have to be blocked by anyone. And it's like, no, because what it says, the organization is very suspicious, right, of our sin and our ability to sin. And they put policies and procedures in place to keep us safe. Let me give you some other real quick ones. This is from The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, which is a fascinating book by Van Vonderen and Johnson. Okay, so, and you can kind of pick these things up in a service, no problem. Maybe not the first one, but eventually. So you want to make sure that it's a leader that doesn't spend a lot of time power posturing, right? Or demanding a focus on their authority. Right. So if you're in a service and the pastor is very much like, I am the lead, I am the head, I am the authority, I am God's voice in this community. I would be like, that's really interesting,
Yeah.
Yeah. And just question it, right? Or just become aware of it, right? When leaders have a preoccupation with performance, okay, over spiritual growth. So if you come in on a Sunday and it's very much, 10,000 people came to the Easter egg event and, 100,000 was in the bank and there is a time and place to, kind of express the business side of an organization. But if that is part of what the community is wrapped around, I would say that is a preoccupation with performance that is not, I would say that's a red flag. Okay. Yeah. How about I give you two more?
Go for it.
Anytime that you notice in service from the leadership that is speaking an us versus them mentality. Okay. So that can look like our church is the best church, right? So on like an innocence continuum, you're like, oh, isn't that nice? They just think they're amazing. But it actually is the nicest version of an us versus them mentality.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a very slippery slope down into a controlling power dynamic. Right. Yeah. But then there is also like the very overt us versus them, which, I'm sure we all have had experiences with where, how they have figured it out is the way, the method, the metric. And it's like, what's scary about us versus them mentality is it's void of humility, right? And humility is a buffer from arrogance, from pride, from the Lucifer effect.
Yeah. Wow.
Right.
And those are so compelling, Laura. And it's interesting because I can't speak for you. I know there are elements just for me growing up that could be like an us versus them mentality, maybe posturing towards culture in a way that says we're gonna totally chop this area of life out. And so sometimes there can be healthy reasons. Someone can say, well, I have a family member, they have struggled with alcohol, so at family events we're just not going to have alcohol to support them. It's like, okay, that's one thing. But you see people saying like, we have a certain posture towards what modesty looks like in swimming, and because that's not endorsed by our culture, we're just never going to a public pool or a beach. And it's like, whoa, like really? You definitely see that kind of dynamic. So that's so compelling. I'm sure it comes up more in the front of like KJV only, for example, or suits only, or like ripped jeans only, or
that's the thing, right? It can be the suits only, or it can be trend only. It's funny you say that. I had someone send me a screenshot of their church's email saying, hey, everyone, here is the style board for kind of like a Pinterest board, but a style board for what we want you to wear to the recording of our new album. And it was trend is, it was so funny. It was like not hipster, not trendy, not rugged, but, a ripped jean that's not torn. Like, it was just like...
Well,
And I just thought it's very innocent, us versus them. And I understand you're trying to be relevant. You're trying to, it's an evangelistic motive, but
it feels so trivial sometimes given the beauty and depth of the gospel, right? Yeah. Well,
yes.
Laura, I think about one of the things I love about stepping into a worship space that has some really good, diverse international representation is one of the beautiful realities is just realizing how people show up to worship. And there's some people who, for them, it's just they have a very laid back approach to God. And sometimes that's reflected in their demeanor or their apparel, which is totally fair. And sometimes for some people it's more formal. But one of the things I've thought of is I love it when there's a family at our church from Nigeria, and they have the sickest outfits, and not even just in terms of like crazy expensive or something, just vibrant and creatively designed. And they often are dressing in a way that doesn't look just like the next person to them. And you wouldn't want them to. You like love that diversity in the church. So man, this is so compelling, Laura. And so you've touched on some like super significant things.
I know when you sent me these questions, I was like, oh man, we could be here for hours. Yeah.
I was gonna say we don't have 6 hours, but we wish we did. But it's so important, I believe, in this season to be captivated by a Christ-centered vision of the kingdom of God, and in the midst of that, able to see the way God is working, sometimes on grand scales and sometimes on tiny, small scales. And in the midst of all that, continue to have a heart that's captivated by what does it look like to be known by God, to know him, to be transformed by him, and be an agent of transformation in the world. And historically, God has been so gracious to the church, because I don't think there's ever been an era where you couldn't point to the church and say, well, that's a blind spot. But also there's often in the midst of that been areas where you can point and say, oh, that's really healthy and good. And so, you've mentioned earlier, you being at a smaller church before going to, well, not a super small church, but not a mega church before going to a mega church. And some listeners might say, well, are we just like throwing out mega churches? And obviously, just with what you said, you're not someone who supports an us versus them mentality.
Yeah, totally.
So in the context of a Western culture where so much good has happened in the West and has come out of the Western church specifically, and yet at the same time, we're in a season where there are so many scandals or crises that seem to be emerging in the Western church. Wrestling with the paradox and all of that, when you consider the Western church, the witness especially of the Western church, what would you say? All right, like this needs to change. And then conversely, what would you say? This needs to be kept and sustained and nurtured going forward.
Okay. Don't hear what I'm going to say.
Okay.
Okay, so what I'm going to say comes from someone who loves Jesus and loves the church, okay, who was vocationally in ministry for the better part of 10 years. And when I say in it, I was in it. We're talking 100-hour work weeks. We're talking so I was so in this thing, right? From a systems perspective, right? To then come back to Canada, completely burnt out, taking a year basically of sabbatical, and then coming out of sabbatical 3 weeks before COVID. So basically going right back into sabbatical for 2 years, okay? From a church engagement perspective, right?
Yes.
This is a perspective that blew my mind in the 3 years that I was out of it, okay? Is this. And I'm saying this with just as a perspective. What I came to realize is that my neighbors do not care what is happening at the church down the street on a Sunday morning. They do not care. They do not notice it. They are not even looking at that Instagram. When they drive by, there's a billboard I drive by and it says, Jesus loves you. And behind it is a photo of a man singing, right? They have no context for what that means, right? They're like, what is that? Is Coldplay coming? Who is the man singing, right? They have no context. They are unmoved by it, okay? So that blew my mind, because in COVID, all we had was our neighbors. And for the first time in my life, I actually became a neighbor, which is so sad when I'm a Christian and we believe, love your neighbor. And I actually didn't know my neighbors. They were unmoved by it. But I will say there was a big but. Until the church met a need. Okay. So I'll give you an example. My neighbor came to my driveway, because it was either my driveway or her driveway for the better part of 2 years, because we couldn't go into each other's houses. And she said to me, she goes, "Oh my gosh, there is a church that's doing craft boxes for free. My friend told me about it." Again, unsaved friend, word just trickled out. "Hey, this church, you just go on, you sign up and they drop off craft boxes." And I'm like, "Wow, that sounds great." At this point, they don't even know my history, right? I'm just a neighbor. I'm just a member of the community, hanging out with kids on a driveway, trying to make it through shutdown. Yeah. Well, I go and I look up this craft box. It's actually all the Sunday school supplies that you need every week, with a link to a video that teaches your kids about how much God loves them, and has a craft that goes with it. Yeah. Totally free. And this group of unchurched moms is spreading the word. Like, can you believe they would do this? This is awesome. Yeah. Can you believe they would do this for us? Right? Oh, now they're moved. Right? You've met a need and you've done it generously. Yeah. Right? Another example, actually, same group of moms recently, just with summer and, things are open and now they have to be back at work. Just a recent conversation of, can you believe how inexpensive these churches run camps for our kids? Like, can you believe it must be a lot of volunteers. Wow. I can't believe people would volunteer to help us. Right. Yeah. So that is a long way. I don't know if you're catching a theme, okay, to how I answer a question. That is a long way of saying, I think generally speaking, the Western world is unmoved by our evangelistic tactics that we think are really working, okay? But what they cannot unsee is a generosity that usurps the cultural norm of capitalism, profit at all costs, humans as products, and humans as consumers. And I think when we look at the gospel, the generosity of God giving his son for free, no expectations, no exchange outside of I receive it, right? The overwhelming generosity of the gospel is what I can't shake. I can't, and let me tell you, if someone has been through church hurt, I can give you stories that would make you vomit. You'd just be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you were in that room, heard that thing, saw that, like, I can't shake Christ on the cross. Right? I can't. Amen to that. I think when we try to like method it, market it, do all of these things, what I have seen as just a neighbor is that when the church steps up, meeting needs generously with no agenda. Yeah. That craft box, there was no come and attend on Sunday or 6 free before you pay. They did it for 2 years. Yeah. Right? And they gave like 6 months warning, we're going to be stopping this. I think it just stopped like 2 months ago. Yeah.
But we just want to bless you. We just want to bless you.
And people can't fathom that.
Yeah. Right? And yet that's what the grace of God is. It's extravagant generosity. Yeah. And it's beautiful showing up in those spaces when people actually realize you really care about me.
Yeah. From a systems perspective, we are all under capitalism, right? We're under what would be a neoliberal, rugged individualism. Yeah. Right? These are all massive macro level structures that have diluted and disseminated all the way down to the micro level person who genuinely feels that unless they can do something or give something or be something, they are without value. Wow. Right? Yeah. How else do you show up in your community in a way that says, see that power structure? He came to dismantle that. Yeah. Right? Then generosity.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the answer, but I think that's one part of you asked a big question.
Of what it means for the church to say, let's be a people of radical, grace-filled, other-centered generosity. Let's keep that. Yeah. Wow. Amen. I mean, that your answer to that question, that was right worth the price of admission right there. We can hang up and go home.
And yet it's free. We're capitalists, free,
So true. Well, Laura, you've shared such valuable insights already on that component. And in a second, I want to pivot a bit more to personal spiritual formation. But before we jump away from this, I'd just love to ask, I mean, deconstruction is a super hot phrase these days, right? People are saying things like, well, I just, don't think it's logical to believe the Bible, or I see my church as actually being damaging in the context of our community or culture, or I've been really hurt by the church. And for some people, they're like, I want to deconstruct because I just want to do what I want with my body and my life. I don't want to be surrendered to Jesus. There's a lot of complex reasons there, but I wonder if we could kind of zero in on the listener or maybe the listener who has a family member or a peer or neighbor who, for really legitimate reasons, like they've seen a toxic church culture, or they've been exposed to really unhealthy people, or seen really damaging power systems in place that have hurt people. So for legitimate reasons has grown disillusioned with their Christian community, or the Christian community that's in their neighborhood or city. And also with that is saying, like, I'm super disillusioned with the church, and I'm really changing what I believe does not perfectly line up with what my parents believe, maybe in terms of how they would have voted, or how they would have dressed, or how they understand sharing the gospel with people, or even their understanding of the role of science and faith, or things like that.
Yeah.
What would you say to those people who are just like, I am so disillusioned, and I'm just questioning if I need to completely throw in the towel on faith?
Yeah. I would say, that's okay. That's what I'd start with. I would say to that person, hey, what you just said doesn't scare me. I'm not freaked out. And believe it or not, the one who made you is not freaked out by that either.
Yes.
Okay. Deconstruction, it's interesting. I did a thing on deconstruction for my brother-in-law's church last year. And while I was researching, I came across, I would say, a fairly prominent pastor who said, people who deconstruct are demonic. And I was like, oh no. I was like, oh my gosh. Am I demonic? Because here I was trying to teach on how to deconstruct.
It's like, uh-oh.
I know, seriously. I was like, oh, let's hold on for a second, look in the mirror here. And I think that what they were getting at is that when deconstruction is for the point of destruction, okay,
or deconversion.
Or deconversion. If that's the agenda, then it's not deconstructive. It's a meta-narrative. It's a new construct. You're just swapping one construct, Christianity, for another, right? Agnostic, atheist. It isn't actually intellectual work.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
tell me more. Yeah. I'm like.
So if your deconstruction is a preset agenda, it's just a new constructed narrative. Okay. You're doing cheap deconstruction. You're swapping, right? Because the reality of deconstruction, at least in my experience, is it is so destabilizing.
Yeah.
That what I would love to do in the process of it, which I'll say what I think it is in a second, in the process of it, it would be so existentially soothing to just say, okay, I pick this.
Yes.
I pick this leader with their theology and their great podcast, and that's it. And I'm just going to soothe and settle here, right? Or we go with our university professor and the prepackaged agnostic, humanistic, whatever, doctrine and dogma that they are selling, right? True deconstruction isn't swapping. I actually think it's unending. And so to really simplify what I believe deconstruction is from a social work perspective too, okay, is an unending suspicion of what I have come to know, what reinforces it, and why I think it's a stable experience of my reality. That is a very fancy way of saying what I thought about God 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 15 years has evolved.
Yeah.
Because I've continued on this journey of knowing and asking and coming to know.
Yeah.
Right? Sanctification is the fanciest way of basically describing a deconstruction journey that goes in a long direction for a long time. Right? I don't think, I mean, when I have read, I love like Amy Carmichael, who is this missionary, she has impacted my life in so many ways. Of Mother Teresa, when you read Dark Night of the Soul, when you watch these people go on long faith journeys that we call it sanctification, it's actually deconstruction, sanctifying deconstruction, where they question things, right? Where they go, do I know all this? It's a humble activity, right? What I would say to the young person, old person, whoever's coming forward and saying, I am disillusioned, I would say, hey, that's okay, right? Welcome to the journey.
Yeah.
The reality is, especially for those who have grown up in the church, who is the population that I find is deconstructing, is that the reason they are is that at some point they were handed a constructed theology, right? From their parents, from their church, from their organization, whatever it is, they were handed that. And at some point, elements of that, if they were never allowed to say, I don't understand that, right? It's part of faith becoming their own.
Yeah.
Right. And from a structural perspective, deconstruction is a form of accountability to the sinful nature of our humanness.
I never thought of that.
Right. It's saying, wait a second, is that healthy? Right. What I will say, okay, let me say something really quick here. Deidre, who is the originator of deconstruction. Okay, so sociologist, hence social work. Okay, what he would say is that deconstruction lays bare the hidden assumptions behind that which we assume to be our world. Right? Our culture heavily influences the hidden assumptions that we have even when we read scripture. Right?
So
and
true.
So what's interesting is that while we deconstruct, we're actually constructing at the same time based off of our ignorant knowing of what we've come to think that the world is, right?
Yeah.
So here we're getting like, Foucault and Deidre and, we're diving into the sociology world. So I'll back it up to say very simply, deconstruction is a journey that is in a long direction. If there's an agenda of destruction, I would say you're doing cheap deconstruction. You're just swamping. Okay. It's about asking questions, and those questions hold people and theologies to account. Right. Because while people have deconstructed evangelicalism, Protestantism, the Roman Catholic Church, what has happened is that actually healthy things have happened. Hey, is it okay to take whole populations of First Nations children, call them savages, and put them in, agricultured land far away and isolated and call it sanctification? I am glad someone asked that question.
Let's ask that question. Yeah.
Right? I am glad, and I would want the board member's wife who is physically beat by her husband, who uses spiritual bypassing, like submit to your husband.
Wow. Yeah.
I want them to ask, actually very carefully with a safety plan. I want them to ask, is this the submission that Christ mentioned?
Had in mind? Yeah.
Is this it? The person who's been sexually assaulted by their pastor, and the pastor says, don't come forward, don't tell anyone, because that will hurt the church. I want that person to deconstruct and go, wait, is it the church that I'm hurting? What if as a member of the church, I'm hurting? Wait, is their power appropriate here? Is that pastorate? What is a pastor? What is the church, right? Deconstruction gives the opportunity for accountability to happen when the systems and the structures with our Lucifer effect really hurt people.
Yeah.
Right? It'll be interesting to listen to that back and see if any of it made sense, you know?
Makes sense. it made great sense to me. Well, and especially that differentiation between, are you moving in a destructive direction or a deconversion? Is that like what you're swapping in?
Yeah.
Or is there this, because I know,
Angst.
Laura, in my own life, in asking hard questions, one of the most messy but redemptive elements was just stopping and saying, in spaces where I've been honest about hurt or
Mm,
brokenness or sin in my life, and I've sensed that a Christian has responded in a way that was severe or condemning or
mm,
coercive or controlling, to stop and say, I can't find a Bible story in the New Testament that gives that exact scenario, but I can see how Jesus responds to broken people. I can see that he
mhm,
touches lepers while they're still covered in leprosy.
mhm,
I can see that he touches women who men would be like, I'm not going to touch that person. I can see that
mhm,
he hangs out with people in these spaces. And I realize that whenever people know that they need healing, Jesus constantly shows up with compassion.
mhm.
And so it makes me ask, is that response from maybe a Christian in my faith community, is that embodying the heart of God? Or maybe is there a more beautiful way that God's heart meets mine in this process?
And I would say that when you read the gospel, you actually find Jesus speaking metaphorically, using parables, and asking a lot of questions. And he stays in an uncomfortable gray zone, not
Hmm.
gray by theological, like, is this right or wrong? But I mean, he encourages people to stick on a journey and go on a journey, right? The whole experience with with Peter, with the disciples, he doesn't ever just come out at the very beginning and say, at the beginning of that 3-year journey, I am the Son of God, this is the plan, and this is what's going to happen.
Hmm.
Right? He takes us on an evolution journey of coming to know who it is that God is.
Yeah.
Right? And this is a big thing, so, oh man, here we go. Not to dive. Maybe after this, we should probably move on because I could dive into stuff. I think people have a really confused understanding of God's sovereignty and control. And I
Hmm.
will put it out, I will dilute it simply to one perspective. In social work, okay, if there is no consent, there's abuse. Okay. Where there's no consent, there's abuse. What I see Jesus doing when he walks with the disciples on a 3-year faith journey, as he's walked with me on a 35-year journey, is that consent is available to me at every single turn. He doesn't tell me what to believe. He doesn't tell me what to think. He provides me with information and allows me to go on the journey. I mean, Peter denied him, chopped off an ear. Peter was the babbling idiot. I've done all of those things in my life, and I probably have decades more of babbling, idiotic, ear chopping, things to do. And yet Jesus in his grace, because consent is also important, said, I'm going to allow you to go on my journey. My grace is sufficient for you.
Hmm.
Right? Could his grace be part of the journey of my coming to know and unknow and re-know and examine and humble myself and stick in this gray, uncomfortable, destabilized human experience that at the end of my deconstruction journey, what ends up deconstructing me is Christ.
Yeah.
He is the undeconstructible core.
Yeah.
That as I deconstruct him, and this is what I would say to the parent who's freaked out about their kid deconstructing. If they're actually deconstructing, not cheaply swapping, if they're actually deconstructing, you don't have to be afraid because he, Christ, is undeconstructible.
Hmm.
You go all the way down that journey, and what you find is that his grace deconstructs you,
Hmm.
and it deconstructs you over and over and over again. And that could make me cry, sit in silence and reverence, and just humbly go, wow, my God, I don't deserve it, understand it, can't earn it. It usurps every structure, every system, everything I've come to know, and washes me from my sin.
Yeah.
Right?
Can't beat that.
I know.
like, how do we go better than this? It's like you could spend your life savoring that reality. Yeah.
And I think I want to be suspicious of coming to know anything, right? Because humility is something that safely buffers us from the Lucifer experience of, I got it, I've figured it out, I'm ready to be worshipped.
Yikes. Yeah, because we are not made for that.
No.
Laura, you've touched on this as we've had this conversation, but that experience you were on of, wow, love serving in ministry, wow, this experience in this context, brutal, leading to burnout, which is no small thing. I mean, many people have, for various reasons, experienced that, and it takes a long time and a lot of intentionality and a lot of personal work to recover from that. And so I thank you. I respect your vulnerability in sharing that. And so I wonder to maybe explore that a little bit more in terms of, there's listeners who've been in that boat. They can say, yes, Laura, that was me. I know what it's like to be burnt out by the church. I know what it is to be severely wounded by the people of God. I know what it is to think, I don't know if I can do this anymore.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to ask, one, what did it look like for you to say, you know what, I've experienced hurt, I've experienced broken trust, I've seen a toxic side of reality in the church, but this is what it looks like to pursue healing, and not just healing coming out of burnout, but some of those practices that you engaged in your private life for emotionally healthy spirituality, and also in your community to pursue emotional health and healthy spirituality. What would you speak to on that front?
Just another small question, right?
Just another small question, kind of a run-on sentence there. I apologize. I'm the king of run-on sentences.
I mean, what a concept, right?
No, I got you. That too.
Yeah. I'll start with this. What it looked like for me when we got home, we were 32 years old or 33. We moved into my parents' house with our 2-year-old. Okay. My husband and I, moving into your parents in your 30s with a baby, really humbling experience. Okay. It looked like being in the fetal position for 6 months.
Wow.
Sleeping like you can't, sleeping and exhausted, just absolute central nervous system crash. It looked like panic, anxiety. It looked, a lot of crying. Then it looked like a little bit more energy. Okay, a little more energy, lots of processing, retelling those 18 months over and over and over again, which I've come to learn is our brain's way of processing trauma. Okay. Now, what's really interesting is when you are someone who has gone to school for 10 years and works with humans, you would think you would be safe from burnout.
No kidding.
Surprisingly, it doesn't protect you. The knowledge doesn't protect you. It looked like, reprocessing. It looks like a lot of Sabbath in sabbatical, right? It looked like boundary setting.
Yeah. Wow.
So for example, I have now rules for myself around, I break the day just to recover from burnout. I break the day into 3 segments: morning, afternoon, evening. I never fill my schedule where all 3 of those have a commitment in them. Okay. I know my capacity now, my endurance. If I'm doing something in the morning and the evening, that's it. The afternoon is blocked. Right. And really understanding my margins and what I'm capable of. I have a rule of life around not committing to anything on the spot. So if someone's like, hey, do you want to do this on Friday? I'm like, can I get back to you? That's my favorite sentence. Hey, can I pull around? Can I get back to you? Can I swing back on that one? Like any variation of that. It looked like slowly coming out from what I would call turtling and going to a dinner party with people. Right? The thought of going into a church, I could not have done it. What was so awesome about COVID is it felt like all of a sudden church came to me when I was in my absolute brokenness, and I could come out of my little turtle shell and put something on YouTube and just dip my toe into community again, right? Just try it. And I will say this, the trauma of spiritual abuse, burnout as a result, and all of that, as recent as 2 months ago, I went to a church and they had an Australian guest speaker. Right, I had a full panic attack.
Ooh.
Knowing, and I'm like sitting there doing all of this, the tools and strategies that I have, and I'm okay. This 50-year-old white Australian man is not a threat to you. You are not in danger right now. You do not need, I was there as a guest of someone. And if I wasn't, I would have left that building, picked my kids up in 2 minutes, flat in the car, bawling my brains out. That was 2 months ago.
Yeah.
Right? So there are some real visceral reactions that we can have when we've been harmed in community that people, if they don't know your journey, will say, oh, you're just so bitter. Right? Or, you're unforgiving. And it's like, well, what if pain is significant, right? What if trauma actually inhibits people's ability to enter back into community unless they have studied how to keep themselves safe, which was your first question. What's healthy, what's not?
Yeah.
Right? And not in a critical judgment way, right? Like, oh, that pastor, screw him, I'm bitter, can't trust him. No, in a, hey, they are totally human. I am totally human, right? How do I engage in community in a safe and healthy way?
Yeah.
So it looks like going very slow. Okay. And I will tell you, during that season, both my husband and I had dozens of people say to us, you're forsaking your calling.
Ooh, that's harsh.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh, I hope I am not. And if I am, I can't do anything about it. I am so broken right now.
Yeah.
People that would say, oh, the Fesses are so bitter, and it's coming from a place of bitterness. And it's like, I hope it's not, I really don't want it to be, but I'm not okay.
Yeah.
I remember even saying to a pastor friend, like, who they actually wanted to hire us. And they were, we were like, no, we're not in a good place. And they said, well, let us take you out for dinner. Like, well, really not like going to say yes. We went out for dinner. We shared our story and they said, wow, that's just so transparent of you. So why didn't you just come? Or I was like, this is not me being transparent. I'm dying.
Like I don't have what it takes to do one day in a ministry setting right now. Yeah.
No, it will not be good for anyone, right? So practically it looks like going very slow. It looks like understanding that a lot of people's judgments of the journey we were on was because they were scared for us, right? And the reality is I was scared too. It was not a fun journey, right? Or a fun experience. So for those that have been hurt by the church and don't know how to re-enter, okay, I would say that one of the things that churches can do or that we can start doing as believers is actually doing conflict resolution, right? So spiritual bypassing is this term that is used to describe using spiritual concepts to avoid emotional pain, difficulties, addressing things. So, you probably have heard them all the time. Like, trying to think off the top of my head of examples of spiritual bypassing, but it's like, oh, God won't give you any more than you can handle. Right?
Like, nope.
Right? When someone is like, two of their children have just attempted suicide and their husband's leaving them, and someone at church says, oh, but God won't give you more than you can handle. You're like, I'm
going to punch you in the throat.
Yeah, you're like, I can't avoid the pain of this, but we will do that, right? One of the spiritual bypassing that I think is prevalent in church communities that actually hinders people from being able to engage in a healthy way is the concept of forgiveness. Don't hear what I'm not saying. Do we forgive? Yes. Is forgiveness what is demanded of us and asked of us and revealed to us? Yes. But forgiveness without conflict resolution, without trying conflict resolution, is spiritual bypassing. Okay. Now, the person that perpetrated my family when we were overseas, from a spiritual perspective, unfortunately, there is no conflict resolution that can happen there because they're not open to it. right? So I have to go on the personal journey of forgiveness, which, man, you want to reveal God's grace and how difficult that is in your life? Forgiveness.
Yeah.
When the party is not willing. But what would restore something like that? Resolution. Two people sitting at a table, probably with a third party, saying that hurt. And them saying, tell me more. And then the person saying, okay. And then them saying, this was my perspective. And then saying, oh my gosh, I can see your perspective. I didn't want you to hurt. I didn't want to be hurt. I don't want to hurt you. Oh my gosh. Would you forgive me? Yes. Would you forgive me? Yes. Can I tell you that the pain and agony of the last 5 years would, right? Unfortunately, and this is from like a pastoring perspective, you know, I've sat in rooms where there's some person at church who's always upset about things and they just get dismissed, right? Oh, that's Susie. You know, she's always got a beef about something. And, you know, Susie wrote another email to the church. And, you know, a lot of times we avoid conflict because we think it's more spiritual to reflect the grace of forgiving. But the reality is, I mean, I've had Susies in my life who wrote me a lot of emails. And if we don't do conflict resolution with that, it doesn't matter how much I say I've forgiven them. I hold a bitterness towards them. They can tell. They experience no peace. And I've just then reinforced to them that they are an unseen, unvalued, unknown person who now goes to another church and re-experiences that all over again. Okay. I think one strategy that could be applied in a church setting is engaging in conflict. Can I tell you that every critique I have, I see myself as complicit in. I have done all these things, right? I remember a teenager who I could not stand, drove me nuts, irritated me like no end, came up to me and said, Pastor Laura, you don't like me, do you? And I remember thinking, they can tell. Not like, oh my gosh, you know, I have been complicit in power. I've been complicit in structures that hurt people, that use people. I mean, we haven't even talked about turning humans into human capital and the volunteer culture that really wreaks havoc on families, doesn't let people set boundaries, but tells them this is going to help you. Like, I have been complicit in all of these criticisms. The person that I hold accountable the most, me. What was it that made me go to this church in the States? You know, was it God? Yeah, probably. But was it his attempt to reveal the narcissistic nature that is deep within me who wanted to build something? Probably. Probably he did it, led me there not to reveal this other person's sin, but to reveal mine. Okay. So I see myself complicit in all of this. Okay. And I would say to that person, I would think that that leader is not capable of giving you what you need. And if there's a way to speak to the power system and bring in a real reconciliation, that would be awesome. But if not, I would walk away. Right. But I would do restorative work where possible. And that may mean therapy. Okay. That may mean working with a spiritual director to actually bring restoration, because in that situation, conflict resolution is not possible. It's going to be your personal journey of forgiveness.
Yeah.
And that one's hard.
Absolutely. Laura, we have touched on so many significant things here, and I appreciate not only your ability to communicate really significant realities so well, but you being able to touch on some really significant spheres and keep moving with the trajectory of the interview without being like, wow, like, whoa. Because yes, there's so many really crucial things you've touched on that we can talk about. But I wanted to say, you know, we've discussed so much. You've been so candid, and I'm so grateful you've shared a lot of compelling insights with listeners. But to end on a positive note, in light of all we've discussed, not that everything hasn't been positive, but, you know, in light of all the intense things we've discussed, when you look to the future and you think about the church, you think about the kingdom of God, you think about the people of God, what would you say? You know what, Luke, these are some of the realities that give me hope.
Yeah. I guess this is what I would say. I think that, I think we're actually, okay, no, I have no grounds of authority to say this. Okay.
But you're going to go for it anyways.
So this is a part-time stay-at-home mom who ruminates and walks with the Lord when I pick up my kids and prays during tantrums. Okay. So I have no authority to say this, but I actually think we're in a reformation. Okay.
Do tell. Keep going.
I think that the church is being reformed. And I think that COVID is a big part of it. I think when you look through church history, we are at a place where church was a meal in a home, which was communion. And when the church back in the Bible times became the dominant religion, they then moved into all of these now vacant cathedrals to other gods. So it went from a dinner table to then communion in a cathedral to then an altar, right? In a massive architectural amazingness, to a platform, right? Dinner from a platform is really hard. I don't know if you've noticed it. To stage, right? So before COVID, most of our church, Western church specifically, experience was we went from communion around a dinner table to communion from a stage, right? It's very hard to have community if I'm eating dinner with you and you're up there. And COVID, I think part of the reformation that is happening is it stripped our stages, it stripped everything. And it literally, when I think about what my COVID experience was me and my husband and our 2 kids doing communion in our home around our table. Saying, here I am in my normal, radically normal, ordinary life, eating my normal bread, accomplishing nothing, producing nothing, giving nothing, because I'm stranded in this little home. And yet, as we break this bread, the presence of my Savior is here with me. And that's enough. And he just loves me, right? I think we're being stripped of a lot of the ways that our culture has infiltrated the structure, right? And I think the body of Christ is being revealed. And I think it looks a lot different than what we think it is, right? Church is a gathering of believers, right? I like when people are like, I am the church. I'm like, I get what you're saying, but church is a gathering, okay? My gathering for 2 years looked like me, my husband, and 2 kids, right? Was it still valid? My gosh, what I learned in those 2 years, what I unlearned in those 2 years, you know? I don't think that God has abandoned us. So what gives me hope for the future? I think that he's deconstructing us, right? I thought it was what Reformation is, right? He's deconstructing us. And like I said earlier, at the end of that journey, as he deconstructs me, what stands is the cross.
Yeah. There's
nothing that compares. Right? So does that give me hope? Oh, yeah. That's all of it. It's all of it.
Yeah. So. And that's a beautiful note to land the plane on. I wonder, Laura, for people who are saying, I want to learn more. I want to engage with Laura. I want to hear about what she's doing. I want to take in some of the really good insights that she's sharing. What are some of the ways, or what are some of the places, especially online, that people could connect with you, find out more about what you're doing, and continue to grow?
Well, where you can normally engage with me is at a local park, but I probably won't tell you that, that might be too much information to put out there. But, you can always shoot me an email. My email is laura@voxmentalhealth.com. Okay. My personal Instagram is just me and my kids. You probably don't want to engage with me there. But if you are on a faith journey and you're like, I just want to email someone, process this with someone, shoot me an email.
Laura, you've shared so much and are doing such good work. So thank you. I really am grateful for you taking the time to contribute to this conversation today.